Today we have with us from Washington, Congressman Jim Himes, who represents Connecticut's 4th District in the House of Representatives, where he is serving his 8th term. He serves as ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and on the House Financial Services Committee. By way of background, Jim grew up as a child of a single working mom in a small town. As a member of Congress, Jim works hard to provide all American children the same opportunities he had to succeed: access to a first-rate public school, affordable and effective health care, a decent and safe home, and a supportive community. Born in Lima, Peru, to American parents, Jim spent the early years of his life in Peru and Colombia, while his father worked for the Ford Foundation and for UNICEF. As an American abroad, Jim grew up fluent in both Spanish and English and was raised with an awareness of the unique position of the United States in the world. Jim graduated from Harvard University and then received a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. Prior to his service in Congress, Jim ran the New York City branch of the Enterprise Community Partners, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing the unique challenges of urban poverty. Jim's team led the way in financing the construction of thousands of affordable housing units in the New York metropolitan region. Jim's experience at Enterprise spurred his involvement in politics. Putting his expertise in affordable housing to work, Jim served as commissioner of the Greenwich Housing Authority, ultimately chairing its board. Jim went on to become an elected member of his town's finance board, setting tax and budget policy for the city of Greenwich. He has also served as chair of his local Democratic town committee. Jim began his professional career at Goldman Sachs, where he worked his way up to vice president over the course of a 12-year career. There he worked extensively in Latin America and headed the bank's telecommunications technology group. So Jim, we'd like to hear your thoughts today on several important topics. Let's start with today's immediate challenge. Do you think we're on the verge of resolving the dispute between the parties on suspending the debt ceiling and managing federal spending? A bill has now passed through the House Rules Committee. What challenges remain?
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I'm delighted to be with you, and very sorry I can't be with you in person. I was intending to be there this morning, but then of course the resolution for this debt ceiling crisis presented itself, and I was in Washington late last night, and hopefully will be later this afternoon resolving this issue. And I'm delighted by the format. Let's talk about whatever you want to talk about. I do hope we have the chance to talk about a couple of things. Number one, we're going to talk about some problems. We're going to, I hope, talk about China, which is worthy of a lot of careful thinking right now. I will answer the question on the debt ceiling momentarily. I hope we'll talk a little bit about our politics. Our politics, in my view, have come to be one of the biggest challenges to our own democratic republic and, quite frankly, to our leadership abroad. And I have some thoughts on that. As somebody who was one of the last out of the chamber of the House of Representatives on January 6th. So I've got some thoughts on maybe some things we could do to try to get back to a more a politics more worthy of the American people. But let me get straight to your question, which is, yes, I do think that we will resolve this debt ceiling impasse today. There will be a few bumps along the road. I'll spare you all the procedural details, but to say that I do think that by midnight tonight, we will have in the House passed the debt ceiling deal. It will lose the votes of the far left and the far right, but I do think that most of my colleagues understand, as much as they may not love what's in the deal, and I don't think anybody loves what's in the deal. It's a small, surly little deal that doesn't really have much effect. But most of my colleagues understand both the catastrophe that would be involved in the federal government for the first time in its 250 years of existence, not actually paying its bills because it doesn't have cash in the treasury. But also there's a hunger here for the kind of compromise that allows us to get on to the more or let me say the less artificial problems. The country has problems we need to address. The debt ceiling, some of you will know that I was a supporter of the Simpson-Bowles deal, which was in the last 15 years, the one honest effort to really get our long-term spending under control. I voted for it along with 32 of my 435 colleagues, which indicates to you the level of appetite around here for honest budgeting. But last thing I'll say on this is the debt ceiling was instituted decades ago with the idea that it would serve as a control on the debt. And if it did, in fact, serve as a control on the debt, I wouldn't say this, but of course, it never has done that. Instead, what it has done is every year or two or three, we get a hostage situation where it usually happens when the Republicans control the House of Representatives and there's a Democratic president. It didn't happen when there was a Republican president in the last 4 years, in which the debt ceiling was raised 3 times without incident. But it becomes subject to this sort of ransom list where unless you do the following 20 things, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling, which is equivalent, of course, to the federal government defaulting on its obligations, which is a financial and capital markets apocalypse. So I'll just, I hope that eventually we learn from this and go back to actually getting legislation done the way the founders would have us do it, which is passing legislation in the House and the Senate and getting the president to sign it, rather than legislation brought forward because there is leverage associated with the possibility of default. So I am an optimist today. I have not been that optimistic, but I am an optimist today. I do think that this will pass. Then it moves on to the United States Senate, which I'm a lot less knowledgeable on. But again, most people wandering the halls of the Capitol today understand the absolute necessity to get this done and to move on to more to less artificially created problems.
Jim, let me follow up with a related question. As publicly reported, many Americans desire that both parties move away from ideological extremes to pursue practical and reasonable legislative solutions. So having heard you, how are we going to get there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And thank you for asking it. And again, this maybe allows me to share some reflections about how toxic our politics got. You know, the pinnacle of that toxicity, of course, was a violent attack on the global symbol of our democracy on January 6th, 2 years ago, which resulted in any number of deaths, and now has resulted in thousands of people being prosecuted for what occurred. That's just not a place that we as Americans should be. It's not a place where, Vladimir Putin or President Xi or the leadership of Iran or North Korea should be able to point to America and say, look, democracy doesn't work. It's especially absurd in my mind because all of us have our gripes about this country. Of course we do. One of the beauties of American democracy is that we're never really satisfied. But are we a country in massive crisis? Of course we're not. And we haven't been in any meaningful way in the last 2 generations. One could argue that the Vietnam War tore this country apart in a brutal way. But if we get away from the partisan talking points, if we can tear ourselves away from MSNBC and Fox, we have the lowest unemployment rate today in history. That's certainly true of African Americans. So the unemployment rate amongst African Americans is below 5%. Everyone in the world wants to come to the United States. Pakistanis don't want to go to Brazil. Indians and emigrate. They want to come here because we have, messy though it may be, the best democracy, I would argue, on the planet. And, name for me an Asian tech company, there's 1 or 2. Name for me a European innovative company, there's 1 or 2. There's 30 of them in 2 counties in California. So anyway, my point is that we would tear ourselves apart when we're actually doing pretty well is madness. It is absolute madness. And so the answer to the question, which I've now been pontificating on for a little while, is pretty clear. Look, there's some structural things we need to do. We should move to ranked choice voting, which the state of Maine and the state of Alaska have already done. Ranked choice voting, I won't get into the mechanics of it because it gets pretty complicated, but ranked choice voting has the effect of depowering the extremes in a primary or in any election, right? Because you can vote for your extreme candidate, but then you cast a second vote for the second round that can be a nod towards what the likely outcome is going to be. So I won't get into the mechanics, but ranked choice voting is something that would depower the extremes and empower the middle. Open primaries, which we do not have in Connecticut, open primaries would empower the middle. If you think about what happens in a primary, and I feel this in my party, because I am to the right of the center of gravity of the Democratic Party. So I fear, quite frankly, a primary, which is a tiny low turnout event in which your most activist, most ferocious voters select the candidate. So another thing we could do structurally would be to allow for the unaffiliated, which tend in some towns to be the biggest number of voters in town, maybe true in Darien, to vote in one party primary. Again, that would depower the extremes and empower the center. I could go on structural changes, gerrymandering, which create deep blue or deep red districts, has the effect, again, of empowering the extremes. Many of my colleagues don't worry about the November election. They don't have to worry about debating a Republican or debating a Democrat. They just need to worry about winning a primary. I feel this pretty intensely because in 2008, I won an election against a Republican in a Republican district. And today, for a whole bunch of reasons, the 4th District of Connecticut is a pretty blue district. And so I've seen both sides of that swing, and I will tell you that my most reasonable behavior comes when the district is contestable, when it's purple, when I and my colleagues need to worry about the November election. Okay, I'll leave the structural proposals behind here to say two other things. Number one, social media is terribly badly exacerbating our problem here. I'm a deep skeptic to the notion that things are different, but things are different on social media. We're all very familiar with yellow journalism and bombastic press, and this goes back to William Randolph Hearst in the early 1900s. Social media is different because the social media platforms know you as intimately as your spouse does, because they see your behavior, and because the algorithms in social media know you so well, they know how to keep you engaged. And it's a funny quirk of the human mind that engagement is often most intense when it is driven by grievance and anger and negative emotions. So I'll leave that alone because A, it's very complicated, but B, the federal government has no business regulating media. It is in the First Amendment. So everything from the notion of a disinformation commission, which makes me want to resign my position when the Biden administration proposes it. It's right out of, well, in reality, it wasn't right out of George Orwell, 1984, but it's a terrible idea, to the notion of banning TikTok, which, again, if you want to ban TikTok, and I'm the senior Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, I know why people want to ban TikTok, but tell me what else you can ban. Can you ban the New York Times? Can you ban Fox News? And so anyway, it's a very, very difficult problem because one of the reasons our country is great is that we don't let the government control the information that we have access to. Last thing I want to say, and I feel very, very strongly about this, is, and I'm delighted to put this in front of people who are probably Vietnam era and Korea, maybe even some Korea era veterans. We spend all our time luxuriating in the liberties and freedoms associated with our citizenship, and we don't spend a damn minute on the obligations of citizenship. I don't know where that discussion went, but we have the privilege of being citizens of the American Republic in the 21st century, and you wouldn't choose anything differently. And so why don't we think about our obligations? One of which I would argue is to be a thoughtful, critical thinker with a sense of humility. Whenever a politician says the country's going down the tubes, you won't have a country anymore, when the other side is described as treasonous and un-American or fascist and un-American, the individual saying those things or feeling those things is failing in that individual's obligation to be a constructive citizen in our democracy. So sometimes people say, Himes, what are you going to do about it? And I say, look, I'll talk about ranked choice voting and primaries all day long, but as long as we have a populace that seems to thrill in violent imagery, that accepts the notion that violence may be okay as a way of achieving political ends, that believes that the other side, rather than the loyal opposition, is a treasonous un-American tribe, if we keep going down that road, we will lose our democracy. And it's up to us to choose not to go down that road.
I would remind you all, and Terry Wood spoke to our group. She recommended that we read a book by Richard Haas on obligations of American citizens. It's worthy of reading. Let me switch gears for a minute. Can we talk about the continuing efforts to forge a middle ground consensus on congressional legislation that could alter the course of destructive gun violence?
Yeah, good. And I promise I will be more disciplined about giving more brief answers. But the future of our democracy, as you can tell, gets me pretty engaged. Okay, so right now states are largely determining the nature of the regulation of our Second Amendment right to bear arms. And just because I represent you guys, you should know I pledge an oath to uphold the Second Amendment. I don't get to choose which amendments I like and don't like. I have pledged an oath to uphold the Second Amendment. I believe in it. I happen to like firearms. I love target shooting, done a little bit of hunting. And I also believe that we could do a much better job keeping weapons out of the hands of people who are going to use them for violence. And let's have a real conversation here. The majority of gun violence in this country is actually not the kind of violence that makes the front page. 2/3 or so of our gun deaths in this country are suicides. So we should start this discussion with fairly boring discussions of requirements for safe storage. I don't think it impinges your Second Amendment rights one bit to suggest that we should move into a world where only a gun's owner can fire that gun. Safe storage, all the things that are recommended to responsible gun owners. And then we should move on to a conversation that, frankly, I think will have less impact, but will have some impact, which is some of the things that the state of Connecticut has done that are consistent with your Second Amendment rights. No court has ever found that Connecticut's regulations are inconsistent with constitutional rights. So universal background check, red flag laws, which permit police to temporarily, and with the right of appeal, remove someone's firearms if they are deemed to be a danger to themselves or to others. I would happen to support, though I wouldn't die on this hill, an assault weapon ban. And the reason I'm not going to die on that hill is that I have 5 other things that I've already talked about that I know would be much more impactful at reducing violence. But look, the bottom line here is that it's hard to have this conversation because it's become such an element of the culture war. You know, you're either a Chardonnay sipping, brie eating, effete coastal elite who doesn't understand firearms, or you're a, gun worshiping, rootin' tooting. That's a silly place for us to be. So to make a very long answer slightly shorter, I would just say, eventually at the federal level, we're going to need to codify some of the regulations that Connecticut has put in place. And I do think that it's not going to be fast, but I do think that it will happen. In the last Congress, when the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate and the presidency, we passed a bipartisan gun safety bill that provided a lot of resources for mental health care. It tightened up background checks. It was a small bill, but it passed with bipartisan support. So I'm not willing to give up hope that we can't make a little bit more progress on this uniquely American carnage that is associated with, that is a result of gun deaths around the country.
So different, but also incredibly important topic. Is there any real prospect of achieving an agreement on a rational, humane, feasible, and disciplined plan that could resolve the immigration crisis?
Yes, there is. Again, I'm not going to tell you that it's now, but there is. And I know that because in 2015, the United States Senate passed exactly the bill we need to pass. And by the way, it passed it with some 68 senators. That never happens in the United States Senate. And I'm not sure it could happen today. But my point is, we know what that bill looks like. And let me tell you the 3 things that are in that bill. Number 1, secure borders. I don't care what party you are, a country needs secure borders, and we don't have secure borders right now. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you build a 2,000 mile long wall. It means you use technology. It means you are smart about secure borders. Number 2, it means you get at the underlying causes that cause people to go to near fatal lengths to try to sneak into our country. I would say 2 things. Number 1, you use things like E-Verify to make sure that the many, many employers who are providing jobs to people who are undocumented get held accountable for doing so. We have the technology to make that happen. And then number 2, and this is a lot less sexy to talk about, but you start thinking about what is happening in a place like Honduras or El Salvador and Guatemala that is so horrid, so violent, and such dire poverty that a mother will put their 8-year-old child into the hands of a cartel member to try to get them into the United States. So really, I would put it this way: we should stop ignoring the plight of our near neighbors in ways that would benefit all of us. Let's do a lot more trade, a lot more development, a lot more investment in South America. And thirdly, we're left with the hard problem of what do we do with the undocumented population in the country? There's some 10, 11 million undocumented Americans. And I would say two things to that. Number one, let's be humane in how we talk about these people. You see them every day. If you go to a restaurant in Stanford, or if you have a contractor work on your house, or have people mowing your lawn, there's a very good chance that you see them every day. So let's start with a position of humanity and charitability. Let's not call these people evil or dehumanize them. And then number two, let's do the hard work to normalize if they've been in this country working hard, paying their taxes over a period of time, 10 years, 11 years, let's normalize their status. If they've abided by the law and paid their taxes and all that stuff. Let's not put them ahead of the line of people who have looked to come here legally, but let's give them hope, as so many of our ancestors have, that if they do the right thing and act like good Americans, they will someday down the road become an American. So that's what the deal looks like. Could it happen today? No, we're too polarized for it to happen today. How will it happen? It'll happen because the business community presses the Congress and says, hey, we need more engineers. It'll be because the agricultural community says, we can't bring in the harvest without hundreds of thousands of migrant laborers. So I do think that the pressure will build over time. We know what the answer looks like. And again, we just need to sort of calm down our rhetoric and calm down our politics so that we get to this, to get to that solution.
Well, let me turn to the subject of foreign affairs. We are now in the second year of a major conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. Do you believe that Congress will authorize funding to sustain our country's support of Ukraine at a level that, in combination with the contributions from our allies, will eventually permit Ukraine to achieve some version of victory against Russia?
I do. And I've been working very closely with my Republican counterpart, Chairman Mike Turner of the Intelligence Committee. There is no daylight between us on this issue. That we need to continue in combination with our allies. It's not on us alone. In combination with our allies, we need to continue to give the Ukrainians the tools and the resources they need to win. There's a moral and a practical case for this. And I make the case because I sometimes hear, hey, we have real school problems and highway problems and problems in the United States. And that's a fair question. You know, why should we be spending money in Ukraine when we have challenges in the United States? Absolutely fair question. And the answer to that question is twofold. Number one, there's a moral issue. I don't think any of us want to be back in a world that our grandparents lived in. I think the average age in that room is a little higher than my age, but our grandparents lived in an age where, a European power would just roll tanks over a neighbor for whatever reason. And as a result, twice in the 20th century, we had to send young men and women to Europe to die on European battlefields. And we just don't want to go back to a world where Vladimir Putin or Xi or whoever it might be, in order to achieve some personal political end, is rolling over borders with tanks. Number two, what we know from the 20th century is that when that happens, eventually we get drawn in anyway. And with the construction of NATO, of course, had Vladimir Putin successfully taken Ukraine, my guess is that we would have seen Russian tanks on the Polish border. And here we are once again. So I do believe, in fact, I have been a critic of this administration because I think they've dragged their feet. It is not a morally tenable situation to support stalemate. And that's the Ukrainians have been absolutely remarkable. They've really shown the Russians to be the paper tigers that they are. But stalemate is not a morally tenable position. Hundreds of people die a day. We need to continue to give the Ukrainians the tools that they need to win this thing and get to the point. What does winning mean? Winning means it gets to the point where Vladimir Putin sees a risk to his own regime and says, okay, I'm coming to the table. It's not going to be an easy moment because speaking for myself, I don't want him to get anything out of the terrorism and the violence and the criminality that he has visited on Ukraine. But that's how this needs to end. It cannot end with Vladimir Putin achieving aims that he was hoping to achieve. We just, in a world where there's a North Korea, an Iran, a Beijing, that can't be the end of the story.
Let's talk about the subject of intelligence. You're on the Intelligence Committee. What are your thoughts about the recent intelligence leaks, the risks posed by Chinese spy balloons, and the threat of cyber warfare?
Yeah. The classified information leaks are really appalling, and they're way too regular. Interestingly enough, my first week on the Intelligence Committee was the week that Edward Snowden did all of his damage. And it's just, I mean, it's the very definition of treason to be entrusted with information that, were it to leak, would result in the deaths of Americans or of others, and to leak that information. I won't get into the detail here, but there is a lot of work to be done in terms of better monitoring of 21-year-old airmen in units and in Cape Cod. Needless to say, he's not the only 21-year-old airman or person with access to classified information. So we have a lot of work to do to tighten up access. It's not super easy because information is valuable when it's shared, not when it remains in a silo. So I don't mean to imply that that's a very easy problem to solve, but parts of it are easy to solve. Quite frankly, the Pentagon, I would tell you from studying this for years, the Pentagon is culturally not as attuned to protecting classified information as CIA and NSA are. We need to do some work with the culture and the officers that are inside the Pentagon. And I'm not indicting people here. Officers in the military are about fighting our wars. That's their primary function. And so we just need to make sure that they need to understand that a culture of compliance around classified information is really important. Spy balloon, let me dispense with that quickly. That was sort of a big nothing burger. I don't believe that the Chinese intended to do it. In fact, I'm fairly confident that it was a mistake. That said, when it was drifting over our sites, a bunch of mid-level people decided that they would loiter over some very sensitive areas. That doesn't make me too worried because we got plenty of warning, and many of you will be familiar with the Open Skies Treaty. Under the Open Skies Treaty, for decades now, the Russians have been able to fly their Air Force, their military officers, over our nuclear sites in Wyoming and Colorado and Montana for compliance purposes, just as we fly over Russian nuclear sites. So point is, we've gotten very, very good at battening down the hatches when we know that there's when we know that there are eyes in the skies. So I'm also very confident that the Chinese really didn't get much other than an embarrassment. And then, should the president have shot it down over Montana or South Carolina, pick and choose, I've actually seen the thing. I'm not allowed to discuss it, but I've seen the thing. It is massive. It is massive. It is, I think, several city buses, and I would not want it to have come down over any people or settlements. So, but again, people will second guess the president's decision to let it drift over the continental United States. But I don't think we'll see that again. Cybersecurity. Let me just say this. This is not a fight that we win any more than we win the fight over viruses and pandemics, right? The moment we develop software and capabilities that keep our systems secure, the bad guys will find ways in. And so it's a boring answer, but we need to do two things. We need to continue to provide resources to the very, very smart people at NSA and FBI and elsewhere who are combating this stuff. And we all need to, back to the obligations of citizenship, start doing smarter things, not using our birthday as a password, not clicking on links from Nigerian princes or whatever it may be. So again, I think it's a joint effort to do the best we can against a threat that will only get bigger, right? We're going to soon be living in a world where our refrigerators are talking to our watches, are talking to our cars, and that's going to be a lot of convenience, but it's going to mean a lot of, as my friends in the military say, a lot of attack surface for the bad guys to go after.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is, are you concerned about the rapid pace in the development of AI and its dual application for civilian and military purposes? Do we need more regulation in this area?
Fascinating question. And it's one that I've turned to. I love technology, and I've turned to it in a big way in the last couple of weeks. I don't have a crisp answer for you on that. I'll tell you, having studied it, I don't think we're in danger now. The remarkable, what they call generative AI, this is the chat GPT that can, write you a Shakespearean sonnet, or write you a play, or tell you what you should visit in Paris. That's pretty nifty stuff, but it is a far cry from a sentient, what they call general artificial intelligence, that is a decision-making entity. We're a long way from that, but we will get there eventually. So no time like the present to begin thinking about it. I would tell you that it's a very difficult problem. Again, remember what I said about social media platforms. The federal government must not get in the business of regulating information or access to information or Americans' access to media. I will happily resign before I allow the central government of the United States to tell Americans what kind of information they get access to. So it is a really thorny problem as you think about regulation. What I'd like to propose, you know who hates artificial intelligence more than we do? I say that sort of with a smile on my face. It's the Chinese. We're afraid of it because it's unpredictable. Guess who on the planet really is afraid of unpredictability and lack of control? The answer, of course, is the Chinese regime. So I actually think this may be an area for the Chinese and the American scientists to come together and say, hey, look, let's make advances on this. It's going to provide remarkable positive things the way technology always does, but let's work together to make sure it never gets out of control and to deal with the really hard issues like, should we ever develop an autonomous weapon system? Should we have swarms of drones that are driven by artificial intelligence and behind which there's not a human being pulling a trigger? These are the questions that I think we need to both be thinking about right now, and interestingly enough, perhaps working with the Chinese and others to make sure that humanity, as it were, rather than just the Americans, are thinking intelligently about some of the threats that will be posed in the next probably decade or so.
Last question before we go to Q&A. This is closer to home. Can you talk about the likelihood that Connecticut will receive its fair share of federal government funding for major infrastructure and military investments?
Yeah, well, a big part of my job is to be ferocious in that regard. And I think we're doing pretty well. We did a groundbreaking on the Walk Bridge in Norwalk. That's $1 billion project to rebuild a 110-year-old bridge that was screwing up service up and down the Northeast on Amtrak and the local commuters. And I'm very, very proud of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that we passed in the last Congress, which is going to really help us upgrade our rail lines, our bridges, too many bridges deficient in Connecticut. It will also help us with making sure that everybody has access to good bandwidth, so that this new world where maybe people work from home 1 or 2 days a week can be a really competent world that takes people off the highways, obviously. So it is my job to be ferocious in that regard. Our whole system of funding the government is based on a progressive income tax. It's not entirely true. Obviously, we fund Medicare and Social Security in different ways, but a state with very high incomes like the state of Connecticut will always pay a lot more into the federal kitty than Mississippi will. We're blessed, obviously, with enormous wealth in the state of Connecticut, so we will always send more money to Washington than we get back. The state of Mississippi, which doesn't have a lot of wealthy people and has very, very high needs. Remember, when we talk about the needs that the federal government addresses, we're really talking about two things. I mean, we can talk about food stamps if you want, but those are almost rounding errors on the two big things that the federal government does for people, and that's Medicare and Medicaid, healthcare for seniors and the indigent, and Social Security. Those two things comprise about half of federal spending. So of necessity, a wealthy state will always contribute more to the federal kitty than it will get back. But it is a key part of my job description and my two senator colleagues, and to make sure that we get every dollar that we can, because we are the economic engine, that we are the golden goose, and we need to sustain that economic engine.
Okay, Steve Begici, can you turn on the mic so folks can ask questions? Barry?
Congressman, thank you very much for your presentation, and I really appreciate your views on many topics. And I would have to say to some of my Democratic friends, why can't you be more like Jim Himes? But seriously, one of the issues that I know you mentioned as important was your access to education growing up. One of the biggest issues, I think, in many of our minds is education, the educational system. And of course, not just here in Darien, we're quite proud of our school system, but throughout the rest of the country. We rank so poorly in math and science and even basic reading literacy skills. When I see congressional hearings, when Randy Weingarten is in front of the Congress, they're talking about masks, no masks, COVID, what'd you do? Yet for the last 40 years, we've been sliding relative to the rest of the world in academics and education. I haven't heard word one while she was up there saying, by the way, what are you doing about getting us out of 25th place in the world in math and science? So I'd like to know what your ideas are to, first of all, let's hear more about this on the news, whether it's MSNBC or Fox or CNN, and also what ideas do you have on how this can be attacked? Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. I think the word existential is overused, but the position we enjoy as the world's innovator, if we continue to be 25th on math and science, we will lose that position. And so you ask an economically existential question, and thank you for the shout out. I would just I want to say this: it is my job to represent 750,000 people, many of whom are Republicans, many of whom are independents. So I'm going to try to do that. My Democratic friends and my Republican friends, God bless you for believing what you do in the values. Let's do it in a civil fashion. But I do really try to represent the views of as many of my constituents as I can, not just the Democrats. But thank you for the shout out nonetheless. Okay, so on education, very frustrating for me to address because the federal government, I think rightly so, doesn't have a lot of levers to affect our educational system. I am very happy that the town of Darien and its Board of Education has a lot more control over Darien schools than the Department of Education or anybody here in Washington. And so it's a frustrating one because we just don't have a lot of tools. Yes, we send a lot of money through Title I to challenge schools. So the city of Bridgeport, city of Norwalk, we get a lot of federal money in the form of Title I funds. I think that's appropriate because let's face it, it is much more challenging to educate the son of a single mom who maybe is unemployed in a condition of poverty than it is to educate the daughters of Jim Himes in Greenwich, Connecticut. So that's all appropriate. Let me say this. I hope we're past the terribly disruptive pandemic measures. And I mean, again, let's be humble about this. I'm not sure we've figured out yet whether the masking and the cessation of school and all of that was worth the learning loss and mental health issues that we're seeing in our young people. And I don't want to pillory anybody for that. I don't know about you guys, but I had never seen a global pandemic that killed 10 million people. So again, a little bit of humility. I think many of us were trying to do the right thing, but I just really hope we're beyond that. So, okay, what are the affirmative ideas that I have there? Number one, we do need to never underinvest in our youngest children, in our youngest Americans, and I would suggest that we can do much better. This is going to sound like an oblique answer to your question, but an awful lot of the outcomes once a child arrives at public school at age 5 are determined prior to age 5. I hear from parents and parents and parents that we need to do a much better job providing affordable childcare. Win-win. Children are in an environment where they learn more than if they're sitting in front of grandma's television set, and they therefore arrive prepared to learn at age 5, And mom or dad or whoever now gets an opportunity to be in the workforce, which if they don't have access to childcare, they don't in a meaningful way. So that's an area where I think the federal government can fix a lot of problems very early. Very important. Let me leave to the Darien School Board the proper running of the Darien schools, which they do very, very well. I'm going to note I have very strong feelings about the nature of education that I will largely keep to myself, but to say that we're in this crazy culture war where, once again, the two sides are artificial. Do we teach that we're the greatest country in the world, or do we teach that we were a country that had slavery for 130 years of its existence? The only problem with that question is the word "or," right? Because the right answer is we're the greatest country in the world, and we had slavery for a long time. I'll leave that one alone. And then finally, because it's so important, we now live in a world where once the Darien School Board has done their good work, that's not enough. You can't just be a high school graduate in this country anymore and expect to be middle class. And again, this is another area in which the federal government can weigh in. And let me say emphatically, I didn't used to say this, but you don't need to go to a four-year university like I did. In fact, sometimes that doesn't make sense. Sometimes getting a two-year degree in advanced HVAC or advanced IT or, skills or joining the military or becoming a law enforcement officer. But the point is, regardless of which of those paths you do, you are going to need to continue learning. And we need to make it a lot easier for people to go to community colleges in particular, because our community colleges often address that segment that is trying to climb into the middle class. And as a guy who is still paying tuition for two daughters at staggering amounts of money, we do need to keep pushing our universities and our colleges to not price themselves out of the ability of the middle class to pay. My own alma mater, I went to Harvard University. Harvard charges $75,000 a year, and surprise, surprise, some 96% of people who go to Harvard are on some form of financial aid. That's just a wacky situation, and I hope that there will be innovation around that model. Why 4 years? Why not 3? Why do I have to go to an ivy-colored brick building? Why can't I be working and learn things online? So that's a little bit of a disorganized answer, but it's driven by the fact that A, it's super important, and B, the federal government doesn't have a lot of levers over a lot of the elements of the problem.
So Neil.
Thank you, Congressman. Your answers are very clear and very rational. Earlier, you suggested we should talk about China. So let's talk about China. Is it the threat that we think it is? And how is it all going to end?
Thank you, Sunil. China is both a threat. I would tell you that I worry regularly that we are sliding into a military conflict with China over Taiwan. I would rather not slide into that conflict. Too many Americans, when they think of war, they think of Afghanistan and Iraq, two places in which we tragically lost several thousand young Americans. Military conflict with China is a whole different thing. There are estimates by experts that in the first 3 weeks of a military conflict with China, we could lose 2 aircraft carriers. There's 6,000 people on an aircraft carrier. So we're talking about a very different thing. And that's not even touching what the economic devastation would be associated with the shutting down of Asian shipping lanes. The economic dislocation that we saw in the COVID pandemic would be a cakewalk compared to the economic destruction caused by a war over Taiwan. Not purely up to us, obviously. It would be really helpful if the Chinese would stop, if Xi in particular would stop saber rattling and acting militarily wildly irresponsible. Just yesterday, a Chinese J-16 flew in front of one of our surveillance planes we were clearly in international waters, and a Chinese jet plane flew right in front of the plane. Unprofessional behavior. So the Chinese have a lot to do here. In the interest of keeping my answer crisp, let me say this. Number one, we need to be statesmanlike and thoughtful about China and not just get into this frenzy, which I see in the House of Representatives of we're so angry. It's like I sometimes joke, the House of Representatives, when the French wouldn't let us, do what we wanted to do in Iraq, we renamed French fries in the House cafeteria freedom fries. That is just not the way to think about China. because we have profound areas of common interest, chiefly economically. We do $700 billion in annual trade with China. I urge you to look at the clothing you're wearing and the seats you're sitting in and the technology you're using. Good chance that much of that was made in China. And if that stops, people are impoverished. So some of my colleagues get into this mentality of, well, it's a new Cold War. No. It is not a new Cold War. The Soviet Union was a very dangerous place, but we did not trade with the Soviet Union in any meaningful way. IBM and Google and Intel were not invested in the Soviet Union. And so anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying we need to step back and say the Chinese do appalling things against the Uyghurs, militarily irresponsible in the region. They've become much more aggressive. They steal our IP. They help deindustrialize the United States through manipulation of their currency. Make no mistake, they do terrible things. But we have profound areas of common interest that we need to therefore respond with sort of statesman-like care. Let's work with the Chinese in areas of common interest. I mentioned AI before, addressing pandemics. They've been wildly irresponsible around COVID. Let's change that so that we don't have 11 million people dead on the planet the next time something emerges in a wet market in Shenzhen or wherever. So I'm on a little bit of a tear to try to get the business community in particular, which is very invested in China, to get the Europeans. We do a lot of trade with China. The Germans do far more as a percentage of their economy, to say, let's be statesmanlike about this. Let's oppose the Chinese on those things that they're clearly out of line on, but let's acknowledge that they're a rising power and they expect certain privileges associated with being a rising power, and that we have lots of areas of common interest.
Rick.
Jim, first of all, I want to acknowledge my appreciation for the fact that you take really thoughtful approaches to challenges and problems rather than necessarily the noisiest partisan solutions. But I want to draw a moment from your background, from your experience rather than the legislative calendar. And that is, you know, in your bio, you inevitably show this experience you've had both in South and Latin America and also in housing. And yet those are two issues that I don't see rising to the conversation within the legislative space. What are your ideas on bringing your experience and passion on those subjects to public policy?
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Let me try to be a little bit crisper again. I keep trying that and failing. But okay, on housing, frustrating issue like education, not one in which the federal government. I promise you, I will oppose ideas of having the federal government come in and tell Darien or Stanford or Bridgeport how they should build housing. That's really appropriately a state and local issue. That said, this country must build a lot more housing, and I sometimes, you know. We absolutely need to subsidize poor people's access to decent housing, but the core problem here is a lack of supply. There's an estimated 5 million units that we need in this country nationally, in order to make housing accessible to the middle class. So now here's where it gets interesting, right? And you know, thank goodness I don't need to participate in the fights that your representatives in Hartford do. You know, what is Darien's obligation to build more housing? Some people say we don't have an obligation, and that's fine, but you know, that also has implications for the ability of our economy to grow, the cost of rent and home ownership in a community where we want young people to move in and be innovative. And then, of course, on the other side, you have people who believe that the state should override local control. The answer, obviously, like so many things, is somewhere in the middle, right? And I actually think Darien does a wonderful job. This goes back, I think, to Yvonne Klein, who started some senior housing there in Norotan Heights. There's now construction along the highway there. I actually think Darien's doing a really pretty good job. We just need to do a lot better. We just need more housing in the area. And I don't feel shy about saying that, because I'm not talking about building 15-story buildings in downtown Greenwich or downtown Darien. You know, you allow for, you know, additional dwelling units, what are known as ADUs, over people's garages, what people used to call granny suites. You do create some density in urban cores. You can build condos in downtown Greenwich. I don't know that you can necessarily do that in a town as small as Weston, but the point is there are ways to do this in ways that don't fundamentally change the fabric of our communities. But we better get on it. We better get on it, or we're going to have a real problem. And I'll keep pushing that. Sadly, my role, Rick, is more about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, not local zoning. zoning, non-inclusionary zoning. I spent a lot of time thinking about, are we ever going to get these entities out of conservatorship, et cetera. On South America, I think I touched on this earlier. Why that isn't sort of item number 3 on an immigration discussion makes me crazy, because again, I can't get over, as a father, I can't get over how awful your world must be if you're willing to put your young child in the hands of strangers on the off chance that they make it across the Mexican border into the United States. So I do think, and I plan on using my perch on the Intelligence Committee. It's a little awkward because that's more about CIA and NSA, but I do plan on using my perch on that committee to say, hey, you know, after 9/11, for all the obvious reasons, we spent an awful lot of time, energy, money on the Middle East. Let's tend our garden here in. I probably shouldn't refer to Latin America as our garden. That's condescending. But let's pay some attention to our neighbors. I think it's a real win-win if we do.
Question over here.
Congressman Himes, thank you for talking with us. I'm just wondering how hard it is for an individual citizen in your district to get a private meeting with you up in Hartford. Is that at all possible? And
Sure. Almost impossible in Hartford because I never go to Hartford. Thank goodness I only need to come to Washington. But so I have offices in Bridgeport and Stamford, and I'd be delighted. I think I've got a list of meetings of constituents. The only challenge to that is a logistical one. In any given month, we tend to be voting in DC 3 weeks of the 4 weeks. But in that 4th week, that's what I do. I meet with constituents in Stamford or in Bridgeport. And so please, by all means, call the office and say you want to meet. Say that we had this conversation and I told you to do so, and we will make that happen.
oh, thank you so much.
Tom Long. Unmute, Tom. We lost him. He'll be back.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to say, Congressman Himes, that it's very kind of you to squeeze DMA into your busy schedule. We all appreciate it, and you do this year after year, and we're the better for it. You opened your remarks by talking about the toxic environment that exists in Washington and around the country. I'm wondering if you could comment on the fact that the administration seems to do very little explaining and discussing of their thoughts about policy. You know, the president never seems to talk. He never seems to have a press conference. He never seems to voluntarily do much to kind of explain administration viewpoints. And we're left with, kind of nothing but name calling. And I'm not suggesting that previous administrations haven't done some of that, but what do you think the administration could do to do a better job of explaining its policy positions to the country?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm tempted to say that over the years, I've spent a lot of time listening to Joe Biden, and you want that to a point. It's like, I'm pretty used to Joe Biden when he was vice president. About 45 minutes into his speech, he would say, yeah, I've probably gone on too long. But anyway, setting that aside, yeah, no, I'm very conscious of the fact that his staff, controls him probably more than, say, a Bill Clinton would have been controlled or an Obama would have been controlled, certainly more than a Donald Trump was ever controlled. And that is frustrating at times. All I can kind of do is look at the results, and the president has frustrated me on a few counts. I'm a free trader. I want free and fair trade. Let me say that, but this is a protectionist administration, and I've gotten into dogfights with people in the administration. But you know, he's going to land the plane on this debt deal, which I think is, I described it as a small and silly deal. It is. I mean, I'm not excited about it, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. By the way, I do think there are things that should be fundamentally changed. I just don't think they should be negotiated when the risk is national default. So, you know, I have to give him credit for landing the plane on this. I probably shouldn't until midnight tonight, but and then I look back on, you know, what he signed into law in the last go around, and you know, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, you know, it's the biggest investment in our country's infrastructure since the Eisenhower administration, done on a bipartisan basis. The PACT Act, which, you know, on a bipartisan basis provided aid to our soldiers who were exposed to burn pits. The gun safety regulation, which he signed into law. Again, small bill, but bipartisan. The Inflation Reduction Act was not bipartisan, but, you know, I'm hearing very positive things from people who are now only paying $35 a month for insulin. A lot of young people are pretty excited about the climate change issues. So anyway, I guess my answer is, yeah, it does frustrate me that he's not more a silver-tongued orator or more of a Bill Clinton. It would certainly help me because it means I, you know, have to do an awful lot of explaining. But in terms of what he has achieved in his first term, I think there are some pretty substantial bipartisan achievements. And you know, again, I know that in this highly polarized world, that probably sounds strange. You know, when I look at some of my Republican colleagues, they say he's the worst American president in history. I just don't know where that comes from. I don't think he's the worst. I don't think he's the best, but, you know, he's been trundling along, getting some stuff done. But yeah, he's he for better or for worse, his staff keeps him from doing what he loves to do, which is to talk for a very, very long time.
But his lieutenants don't seem to be making up for what we're not getting. So I don't hear anything intelligent from the vice president. I don't hear anything intelligent from Mayorkas. I don't hear anything intelligent from the defense secretary. I don't hear anything intelligent from the entire cabinet. That's my frustration. In other words, I know Joe Biden has weaknesses that have existed for 50 years, but we don't get, you know, you spoke intelligently for the last 45 minutes about I've heard more intelligent commentary from you in 45 minutes than I have from anybody in Washington in the administration in 2 years. It's laughable.
We have another question here.
Fair point, and I appreciate the compliment. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Himes, for your elucidative comments on policy, et cetera. Just looking to the political calendar, it strikes me there's a real disjoint between polling I've seen in terms of the popularity of the presumed Democratic ticket versus other people that are not, you know, a lot of people look forward to a president being 80 plus and wonder. So I just wonder if the you know, the political side might be the momentum and having, you know, the other side, the Republican side, there may be an indictment that completely changes the whole picture. So any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of thoughts on it, but to say that, you know, just looking at the situation, I don't believe there's much that will alter the trajectory of Donald Trump receiving the Republican nomination and Joe Biden receiving the Democratic nomination. I'm not going to get into detail, but, you know, as somebody who watched generational change occur in the House when 83-year-old Nancy Pelosi stepped down in favor of 53-year-old Hakeem Jeffries, that's a nice moment. You know, all of a sudden now your leadership is using language that and culturally sort of resonant. I hate to make too much of a case of this to the Darien Men's Association, but that moment of generational change excites, you know, younger people who often are alienated from politics, and that's evidently not going to be what we see in this next election. You know, and again, I don't want to get into details, but I do worry. You know, the presidency ages anybody. It ages anybody a year for every month you're in that job. And I do really worry about, you know, where Joe Biden is, you know, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if he wins re-election. It's an enormously brutal job. I have existential worries about Donald Trump. And I will, if you want me to, I will tell you 3 or 4 things that I think he did in his administration that I applaud. I will also tell you that I think he took us as close to the destruction of our democracy as we've been since the Civil War. So, as you might sense from my conversation here, yeah, I'm a little worried about that. But at the end of the day, I have very little control over who the nominees are.
Doug Campbell.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm concerned about the 4th branch of government, administrivia. And, I see that the EPA rewriting wetlands, which is being addressed now, rewriting regulations for coal. And not that I agree or disagree, but basically phasing out coal and oil production. And it seems like it's a much bigger issue than it has been. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a classic issue. It's an issue. It's been an issue in our history forever. We spent a lot of time arguing over the authority of the branches of government. And of course, the regulatory entities are executive entities. I'm in the legislature, so I'm naturally suspicious of both judicial power. That's my job constitutionally, to be suspicious of judicial and of executive power. So, and, the politics are pretty predictable, right? When Donald Trump controls the EPA, the Democrats hate the EPA. And when Joe Biden controls it, the Republicans hate the EPA. So it's not a problem we're going to solve, because at the end of the day, it really gets down to how much discretion do experts get. And I will, whatever you think of the EPA, I will tell you, in the service of supporting people who work very, very hard and are very, very expert, that it doesn't mean they get everything right and get paid very little for doing it. The EPA and the CDC and the FBI and the CIA and all of these agencies, SEC, they're staffed by really patriotic, very capable people. But there will always be a tension between how much should Jim Himes, who doesn't know a damn thing about particulate matter in air, whatever it is, parts per million of particulate matter in our air. I know nothing on that topic. So how much should I write the rule on particulate matter in air quality versus leaving it to the scientists at EPA? That's always going to be a tension, and it's always going to be a tension with the court. And, right now, obviously, the left is pretty outraged with this court because it's a very conservative court. They are serving what I think is probably an interest that you would support, which is they are trimming the power of the regulatory state in a pretty significant way. This will, as history progresses, this will fluctuate. I will tell you, having made a bunch of wishy-washy statements, let me tell you this. It is very clear that we do need to fix the process and procedures of the Supreme Court in 2 ways. Number one, and I only say this not because I disagree with Dobbs or because I do, but I don't say this because of that. I say this because the Supreme Court has lower approval ratings amongst the American people than it has in many generations. And so I think 2 things are important, and I would push, and I am pushing for this. Number one, there does need to be a code of ethics for the court. I'm subject to a code of ethics. I need to disclose to all of you what stocks and bonds I own. I need to disclose my sources of income. I am not allowed to take gifts from lobbyists. They need one of those at the Supreme Court very clearly. Number 2, while I would oppose so-called stacking the court, I think that's a bad road to go down. Number 2, it's time to stop playing demographic roulette with the court. Let's impose 18-year terms on the justices and make sure that every president of the United States, if the math works, that if you impose 18-year terms on 9 justices, every president of the United States, I think, appoints 2 justices in 4 years or something like that. So that I feel pretty passionately about. The rest of the stuff, depending on your political point of view, you will learn to love or hate the court, or love or hate the EPA.
Pierre Brown.
Jim, thanks very much for your candor in answering these questions. We can't let this end without mentioning healthcare, and we haven't so far. Our group at our average age or whatever, we're heavy consumers at this stage, and I think we've all had experience with the inefficiencies, the convoluted healthcare system that we do have. And, if you look at the numbers, you would think that our country would have the best healthcare system per dollar or per whatever in the world, but we don't. And I was just interested in your thoughts, not to bring up a socialistic topic, but Bernie Sanders, of course, has been advocating Medicare for all for a number of years now. And I just, do you see any way that we get out of the private healthcare system, which I personally see as extremely inefficient? You don't see this kind of a system for healthcare in any other advanced country in the world.
Yeah, great question. You know, it's funny, when I was a freshman, I cut my teeth on the whole Affordable Care Act debate, which was one heck of a raucous debate. And that's appropriate because people, you know, feel healthcare very personally, and they worry when changes are made to the healthcare system. Let me say two things about it. We could talk for hours on the healthcare system. It is spectacularly inefficient. It's also, for the population that has good access to it, just plain spectacular. My wife is now cancer free, but my family went through a 2-year period in which she was fighting breast cancer, and that was the first time I'd sort of come face to face, because we're pretty healthy, with the healthcare system and the immunotherapies that have been developed to go after cancer in the last 10 years or so are just mind-bogglingly amazing. So for people like me who have access, and I assume you have access to the system, setting aside cost and everything, the results are amazing. And, you know, often it's very tempting for people in my position to beat up on the pharmaceutical companies, because I do think that there's, you know, questions about spending immense amounts of money on advertising and other things that don't contribute to health outcomes. But I also will point out to my more ferocious progressives, when they're beating up on the pharmaceutical companies, I'll sometimes say, oh, really? You mean the pharmaceutical companies that developed a COVID vaccine in 6 months and saved millions of lives? You're those guys? So anyway, my point obviously is that it is a very, very inefficient system that delivers costly but good results to not enough people. And so, you know, the challenge is, of course, to make sure that all Americans, regardless of financial situation, have access to affordable healthcare, and we're far short of where we need to be there. Let me make one suggestion, two suggestions. Bernie Sanders' proposal for Medicare for all as a policy matter is not crazy. I mean, I know some people think it is, but it's not crazy. Medicare for all would simply provide Medicare, which anybody over the age of 65 is familiar with, to all Americans. It would be expensive. But it's far to the right, politically speaking, it's far to the right of the system that they have in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party will go to the mat defending the National Health Service, which is way to the left of what Bernie Sanders wants in this country. So as a policy matter, it's not insane. As a political matter, I can tell you, having done the Affordable Care Act debates, that Americans, you know, there's some 70 million Americans that have private health insurance, and they're just not going to give that up, not anytime soon. So as a political matter, the question is more, how can we keep the cost down and provide more service to people who don't have access? And let me, in the spirit of brevity, offer one thought. There's so much we can do preventatively. The inefficiency in the American system is largely due to a relatively small population of very, very sick Americans. Some of you will know this, but the Medicare system is targeted, of course, it's insurance for people over the age of 65. The Medicare system also pays every dollar for dialysis for every American who requires dialysis, which is usually required when somebody allows diabetes to get out of control. So think about that. We allow people to live the kinds of unhealthy lives that lead to massive obesity and type 2 diabetes. You know, we subsidize corn syrup. A lot of your taxpayer money goes to grow corn, which then gets turned into Coca-Cola, which then gets consumed by an individual who now is diabetic. And now we're paying for that individual, $70,000 a year to have dialysis, which, apart from the money, if you're having regular dialysis, that's a terrible life. You can't work. So you see my point here. If we could really zero in on those areas where we have not just inefficiency, but ridiculous incentives. If we could cut the amount of type 2 diabetes and eat a healthier diet, if we duplicate the success we've had with cigarettes, you know, when I was a kid, much less when most of you were a kid, everybody smoked, and we've gotten over that. If we could do that in more areas, we could provide much better healthcare to many more people. That's where I get super interested, those win-wins. Because honestly, if I go to 70 million Americans and say, guess what? I want to take away your private insurance, and I've got a better idea that'll be done by the federal government. I know what the response will, I know what the political response will be.
We have time for 2 more questions. Jim Phillips.
Yes, Congressman, I would like your views on Social Security, the other big kahuna in the room. It seems that Social Security was initially set up when the average life expectancy of Americans was, I believe, around 69. It would give a healthy security for the last 3 or 4 years of your life. I think the average expectancy is closer to 79 now. What are some of the creative solutions being bandied around the halls of Congress? And I know that, you know, raising the age would not pass in the U.S., but can you provide incentives for people to take Social Security later? There's got to be a solution. I'm curious what you and your congressman are thinking about.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Phillips. So the good news is this is not a terribly complicated problem, in as much as you've got, you know, 5, 6 levers that you can play with in Social Security. So as a mechanical matter, it's not that difficult. You know, you have the age upon which benefits can be received. You have the percentage of your wages withheld from your income. You've got the cap on your income above which your wages are not subject to Social Security withholding. So mechanically speaking, it's a pretty easy problem to solve. Politically, of course, it's much more challenging. And let me say 2 things about that. Sadly, right now, there's no discussion happening about it that is meaningful, meaning that will lead to the deal that ultimately reforms Social Security in such a way to make sure that it is perpetual, as opposed to where we are today, where I forget the exact date, but, you know, we're 7 or 8 or 9 years away from a point where Social Security won't be able to pay full benefits. So here I am addressing you on the day, you know, 4 days before the X date when we would default, and we'll get it done. I sadly believe that will be the story with Social Security. It will wait. And then the deal will be struck to fiddle with all of those levers. And the Democrats will oppose the raise in the rate, and the Republicans will oppose the raise in the percentage, and some combination of those things will be done. Let me engage a little bit more deeply on that. Speaking as a Democrat, I don't have necessarily an ideological absolute opposition to raising the retirement age. You're absolutely right. When Social Security was formed in the 1930s, the retirement age was beyond the average actuarial lifespan of an individual. That's very different today. What I will fight for is the fact that the average age is comprised of real people in this country. And, you know, Jim Himes, who lives a pretty healthy lifestyle and doesn't have to lift heavy things other than metaphorically on any given day, is going to be productive into his, he hopes, into his 80s. But my high school buddy who, you know, is a lumberjack, or even more so, you know, remember the actuarial age for minority lifespans are well below for white lifespan. So you have complexities when you get into who gets to live how long. And so what I will be very careful about when the retirement age thing happens is that whatever adjustments take into account the fact that I'm going to, I hope, be productive, you know, for decades yet to come, whereas the firefighter in Stanford who climbs ladders and lifts heavy things and hurts his back is not going to be able to be productive in all likelihood into his or her 70s. So that's the way I sort of think about it. We're the deal to be on the table right now, but it's going to take some time before we get to the point where that deal will inevitably be made.
Gary Banks.
Hi, Jim. You opened this discussion with your passion for democracy, and I think we all share that with you, everybody in this room. But one of the foundations of that is having a free and fair election that people accept when it's over with, and specifically issues like gerrymandering, messing with the Electoral College, voter access, either who gets to vote or how they get to vote, early voting. And then accepting the outcome when it happens. And I'm really concerned. I really don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me. I guess it's the last question. I'm glad we're sort of closing on this. I mean, let me say two things about that. Number one, election denialism just needs to go away. Back to my obligations of citizenship. If you're promoting the idea that you lost an election, and there's no evidence to support that there was any skullduggery, the act you're doing is not necessarily criminal, but it is deeply erosive to the foundation of our democracy. And sadly, after Donald Trump denied his loss, Kerry Lake in Arizona, it's sort of become the thing, to be fair, amongst a fairly select group of Republicans. That just needs to end. It just needs to end. There can be no compromise with lies, and that is a particularly corrosive lie. Now, by the way, if you show me evidence that elections are being compromised somewhere, I'll be all over that. But we all know that there is zero evidence for any of that instinct. So dispense with that. Secondly, we have a much more interesting conversation that we're having right now with the state of Connecticut. Just yesterday, the legislature, I guess, passed the early voting law, which will, I guess, come before all of us as a referendum item. And there, I think there's room for good discussion, right? I mean, should it be 2 weeks of early voting? Should every town have one location? That's all fine. That's all fine. That's legitimate for us to work out. And different states have different policies. Connecticut actually has had, until very recently, one of the most restrictive policies. We had, you could only vote by absentee if you had a good reason to do it. So anyway, my point is that's all fine. We should have those conversations. And I hope we have those conversations with the idea of making it easier for people to vote. I'm not deeply allergic to producing some ID at a polling place, particularly if there's an alternative for those who don't have ID. At the same time, I will tell you that the notion that there's massive voter fraud out there associated with people not using ID is just not true. So anyway, we need to get rid of this notion, this fallback that if I lost an election, I'm going to say that it was stolen. And then we should have the very good discussions that we're having in the state of Connecticut around how do we make it easier for more Americans to vote. And then, just since I know we're winding up, again, I'll come back to our obligations, right? I've been delighted by the conversation here today because it reflects the, and I'm so happy I get to represent this district, which is thoughtful and moderate and by and large pretty educated. I know that not everybody's happy that I get to represent it, but anyway, my point is simply that we just really need to move away from the language of violence and rage and betrayal and treason. I deal with 12 issues a day here in Washington, and almost every one of them is shades of gray and complicated and trade-offs. And when people start thinking in tribal terms and, this side is so right and this side is so wrong, it saddens me because it harms our democracy. And I don't think those of us who do that are living up to our obligations as citizens.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'll make up for it next go around.
We hope you have a successful conclusion for the day. Here.